Hey, welcome back to Midas Letter Live. My guest in this segment is Brendan Kennedy, CEO of Tilray Inc., trading on NASDAQ under the symbol TLRY. Brendan, thank you for joining me again.
Thank you for having me.
So, amazing transformation from private company to high-flying NASDAQ large cap. It's kind of like you snuck up behind us and surprised everybody. So tell me about the thought process behind that whole sort of trajectory.
Sure. So it's something we'd been working on for about a year and a half, and started down this road about a year ago, meeting with investors in Canada and the U.S. Did about 30 meetings, 15 in the U.S., 15 in Canada. And one of the points of feedback from U.S. investors, so think blue chip, long only mutual funds, was that while a TSX listing would be interesting, they really wanted someone to be the first cannabis company to IPO on a U.S. exchange. They wanted someone regulated by the SEC, and they wanted someone who would report in U.S. GAAP, as opposed to IFRS with all of the biological asset malarkey. And so we took that feedback a year ago and started down a very specific path towards a NASDAQ IPO. We kept it pretty quiet until about 2 weeks beforehand, when we had to publicly disclose.
Right. So congratulations.
Thank you.
B, I mean, the burden of compliance associated with getting an IPO onto NASDAQ as a cannabis company, must boggle the mind. I can only imagine.
You should see our legal bills for NASDAQ and SEC attorneys in order to get us through this process.
Right.
And even 30 days beforehand, a lot of people told us that it was impossible. NASDAQ, SEC will never allow it.
Wow.
But we were confident of the right path.
Sure. To what extent would the pedigree associated with privateer holdings and the people involved with privateer contribute to the fact that you were able to sort of pierce that veil as a seminal event for cannabis companies in the U.S.?
It really helped us. It helped us both in terms of our internal legal counsel and the legal counsel we were able to obtain from outside firms. It also helped with the pedigree of the investors in privateer and the investors in a Tilray round we did in January. We did a round in January that was 10 investors, 9 from the U.S., 1 from Canada, 8 of whom had never invested in cannabis before. And that helped us get us through the process. And I think that if people were to see the orders that came in for the IPO, a lot of the names on the list would surprise you, because they're global blue chip firms that have never invested in this industry before.
Really? So this is the onset of the migration of the largest capital pools of the world finally into the space, I guess.
Definitely. Certainly there was a milestone event that people don't really know about in terms of who participated in the IPO. People will find out when it's disclosed in, I guess, around November. Okay. And that'll be certainly an interesting read.
Right. I'll have to put on my 8K monitors there.
That's right.
Okay, you made an interesting comment about the difference between IFRS and GAAP treatment of biological assets. Is it within your realm of expertise to have a conversation about what that is on a granular basis?
Sure. If you want,
Yeah.
So I mean, you're familiar with how IFRS tracks it, and essentially revenue is being booked while a crop is being grown, and that works for certain products. It would work for chickens or pork or wheat, malt, barley, things like that. There's a lot more variability in terms of cannabis, and so you get this weird situation where companies have gross profit higher than gross revenue.
Negative cost of sales.
That's right. It doesn't make any sense, right?
Well, that's amazing.
And so you just don't see that.
Right.
There's no accounting for biological assets in U.S. GAAP, and so it's revenue is revenue.
Right. So a biological asset can be referred to in inventory, but it can't be added as a input on the balance sheet.
That's exactly right.
Okay. Well, that's comforting to me. I know it's comforting to Al Rosen, who's a forensic accountant we have on the show a lot, because he calls the Canadian big ACMPR growers accounting standards. He calls them financial statements of mass delusion.
And that was certainly what our investors, New York, Boston, mutual funds, they didn't want that.
Right.
They wanted U.S. GAAP because it's something they understand, and it's
well,
apples to apples.
I don't want IFRS treatment
Yes.
because it's like, I seriously, evaluating a company's balance sheet and financials, you have to go through and say, okay, get this negative cost of sales malarkey out of there, and now we generate a real balance sheet. It's astounding to me that practice is permitted, but let's move on. We've said our piece on that.
Sounds good.
Tell me about Tilray's sort of global footprint right now in terms of operations and growth initiatives.
Sure. So let's see. On the cultivation side, the capacity side, we started the year with a capacity of about 8 metric tons. We'll end the year at a run rate capacity of about 90 metric tons, so 90 million grams. So an 11x increase in capacity. We have our existing facility in Nanaimo, British Columbia. We have a 100-acre piece of property in southern Ontario in the township of Enniskillen. Has a 13-acre greenhouse on it, fully operational. And then in Portugal, we have a facility where we grow indoor and outdoor today. I think, as far as I know, we're the only LP that currently grows outdoor somewhere in the world. And we're building a state-of-the-art Dutch glass house there as well. And so Portugal will really be our hub and our production facility for all of our exports to the EU.
Sure.
And so really, it's ideal climate, low-cost labor, tariff-free access to the EU. And so we'll supply all the products for the EU from the EU. Going forward. Currently, Tilray products are available in, I think, 11 countries on 5 continents, and we continue to add new countries on a regular basis. Today, we export everything from Canada, and we'll start dividing that up between Canada and Portugal fairly soon.
Interesting. So then I'm going to suggest then being a private company for the bulk of your existence up until now has not been an impediment to accessing capital or projecting your Tilray sort of strategy across the world.
Definitely not. In some ways, it was an advantage because we were really managing to long-term growth, and our investors really take a long view of the industry. I've been doing this for 8 years. I started in May of 2010 in the cannabis industry, and I tell our employees every day this is day one in the industry. And being private certainly was hugely advantageous to us over the last 5 years. And Tilray, our investors certainly benefited from waiting as long as we did because it really helped with that IPO market cap that was really different from anything we've seen anywhere else in the industry. We were at a disadvantage over the last year to 2 years. Really on 2 points. One is while we were able to raise significant capital from private investors or investors willing to invest in private companies, it just takes more time than accessing capital through a public market. And so that was one disadvantage. We'll be able to raise capital much more quickly now.
Sure.
And then we didn't have a public company stock as currency. And so we haven't been able to conduct M&A transactions with ease like many of our competitors. And we will conduct, I imagine we'll conduct a few M&A transactions over the coming months, but they'll also be really different from what I've seen out there. We're not out looking for a billion-dollar acquisition. That's just not in our DNA.
Sure. The federal prohibition on cannabis in the United States is probably responsible for your choice to grow and ship cannabis from Canada, but it's somewhat counterintuitive and surprising that NASDAQ would allow a cannabis company onto the premier exchange of the United States in many respects, even while federal prohibition existed. So is there some kind of tacit sort of understanding between your legal team and the federal government that makes this possible, or is it even necessary given the incremental pro-cannabis movement that's being made towards federal deprohibition?
No, so what it really means is that everything we do everywhere in the world is legal in the country in which we operate. So we fully comply with Canadian laws, Portuguese laws, German laws, Australian laws. We have 370 employees in 7 countries, and everything we do, everywhere we operate, is fully legal. And so that is what has allowed us to list in the U.S. If you think about a good example would be a company like Sanofi. Sanofi grows poppies in Spain. It would be very illegal if they were to grow poppies in the U.S. to produce opioid alkaloids for pharmaceuticals. And so that's probably the closest analog. Everything we do complies with laws and regulations in all of the countries in which we operate.
Sure.
And so that's how the U.S. government looks at how we operate and why the SEC allowed us to list in the U.S.
I see. Interesting. So from your sort of internal viewpoint, if it's not too much of an invasion of privacy, what do you see happening in terms of when does deprohibition at the federal level happen, especially in view of the fact that the FDA is now in conflict with the DEA as a result of the licensing of an FDA drug by GW Pharma?
Yeah, so I'll speak about a couple of different opportunities, right, that I see taking place. So, when I started 8 years ago, there were 15 countries in the world that had legalized medical cannabis. Today, there's over 35, and it's the pace of change it's so fast, right? In the last 8 weeks, the UK went from not even talking about, I would have predicted the UK would be the last country in the world to legalize medical cannabis. They went from not talking about it 8 weeks ago to legalizing over an 8-week period. Like just astounding growth or change. I see how we get from 35 countries to 40 to 50 to 60 in a pretty short amount of time. A year, 2, 3 years, you're going to see just more and more countries legalize medical cannabis. And so that's a huge opportunity. Obviously, we're going to go from one country in the world, Uruguay, that has legalized cannabis for adult use, to 2, so 100% growth or 1,000% growth. If you think about 3.5 million people in Uruguay and 35 million in Canada, right. And I predict you'll see what I call country number 3, within 12 months of October, and that country will base their regulations on Canada's adult use regulations. And so those are, and you'll see country 3 and country 4 and country 5 in terms of adult use. And so those are the 2 global dynamics that are taking place. And at some point, I think within the next 3 or 4 years, you'll see the U.S. Change its laws. And I think it'll end up being something like a states' rights law. If you look at Congress, a majority of Congress in the U.S. now comes from a district that has legalized some form of cannabis.
Right, right. Okay, and finally, let's talk a bit about the valuation of Tilray, and how do you backfill this valuation in the next 6, 12, 24 months so that it is less speculative and more on the balance sheet, or am I misunderstanding the valuation?
So for us, there have been a lot of metrics that have been used over the last 5 years in this industry to justify really these public company valuations. And certainly we benefited from being able to point to them as comparables over the last 5 years. And if you look back, it used to be about number of patients or vault capacity was a particularly odd valuation metric. Sure. And then funded capacity. At some point, I would say after October 17th, we're actually going to be pointing to 2 real metrics: revenue and profit, and that'll be a relief to shed all those other metrics. And so when I think about the next 2, 3, 4 years for Tilray, it'll be about increasing revenue, global revenue from global medical cannabis, and obviously revenue from adult use cannabis here in Canada and other countries that may legalize. And so we need to continue to build out our capacity and build out brands and products that Canadian consumers love.
Okay, well that's a great update. Congratulations on the Go Public strategy, and thank you for coming in and filling us in.
Thank you so much for having me.